The war that has no name: United States and Iran. A conflict 70 years in the making. A documentary. Narration script * intro. The question no one asks. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a war, not one you've seen in movies, not the kind with constant explosions rattling windows, not the kind with tanks grinding through city streets, not the kind with soldiers marching in formation across borders under the weight of their flags. No. This was a different kind of war, a war that never officially began, and yet never ended. There was no declaration, no opening shot fired at dawn, no final battle, no peace treaty signed at a grand table with cameras watching, just tension. Just silence, just waiting, to nations staring at each other across decades of mistrust, through the fog of proxy wars and secret operations, through sanctions and assassinations, and stolen elections and downed aircraft and burning embassies. This is the story of two nations, the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran, a conflict that has shaped the world for over 70 years, a conflict that has never truly been named for what it is, a conflict that has produced no heroes, only survivors, no victors, only those who endured, and it all began with a decision made in secret, a decision made not on a battlefield, but in a back room, not with weapons, but with words and money and manipulation, a decision that set off a chain of events still echoing today. Let's go back, all the way back to 1953, chapter 11953, the day everything changed in 1953. Iran was not the country we know today. It was a nation full of possibility, a nation waking up to its own identity after decades of foreign interference, colonial pressure, and imperial shadow, a nation that had survived British occupation, Russian influence, and two world wars, not on the front lines, but as a pawn on someone else's board. And in 1953, Iran had something remarkable, a democratic leader. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was 71 years old. He wore simple suits. He sometimes gave speeches from his bed, wrapped in pajamas, because of a heart condition. He cried in parliament. He was, by every account, a deeply emotional man and deeply principled. He had been elected, legitimately, overwhelmingly. The Iranian people had chosen him, and he had made a decision that would change everything. He nationalized Iran's oil. Think about what that means for a moment. Iran sat on one of the largest oil reserves in the world. For decades, a British company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later become BP, had been extracting that oil and shipping the profits back to London. Iranian workers labored in the fields. Iranian land was drilled and scarred, but the wealth flowed outward, to Britain, to shareholders in London, to an empire that had decided Iranian resources belonged, essentially, to them. Mossadegh said, "No more." He said the oil beneath Iranian soil belongs to the Iranian people. He said Iran would take control of its own resources. He said that sovereignty meant something, that independence wasn't just a word. The Iranian parliament voted. The nationalization passed. For ordinary Iranians, this was a moment of profound pride. Finally, a leader who fought for them. A leader who stood up and said, "We are not a colony, we are a nation." But in London and Washington, the reaction was very different. In London, the British government was furious. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company stood to lose everything, and Britain, still clinging to the remnants of its empire, could not allow that precedent to stand. If Iran nationalized its oil and got away with it, what would stop other nations from doing the same? What would happen to British interests in Iraq, in Kuwait, in the wider Middle East? They had to stop it. In Washington, the Americans were initially more cautious. President Truman was not eager to destroy a democratic government. But then Dwight Eisenhower won the election, and his administration, driven by Cold War paranoia and pressure from Britain, began to see Mossadegh differently. The word communist was whispered, then spoken out loud, then shouted. Mossadegh wasn't a communist. He was a nationalist. He was a Democrat. He believed in parliamentary governance and individual rights. But in 1953, in the early years of the Cold War, the Americans needed a reason to act. And communist influence was the reason they gave themselves. The plan was set in motion, behind closed doors, in secret, without the knowledge of the Iranian people, without any democratic process, without a shred of legal authority. The CIA, working alongside British intelligence, MI6, launched a covert operation. Its name, Operation Ajax. In America it was called Ajax. In Britain, Operation Boot. The operation was sophisticated and ruthless. CIA agents funneled money into Iran to bribe politicians, military officers, newspaper editors, and religious leaders. Paid mobs were organized to create the appearance of public unrest. Fake news stories were planted in Iranian newspapers, portraying Mossadegh as a communist, as a traitor, as a man who had lost control of the country. Protests erupted, not organic protests, but manufactured ones. Paid thugs dressed as Mossadegh supporters committed acts of violence, then blamed them on the government. The goal was to make Iran look like it was descending into chaos under Mossadegh's leadership. And it worked. On August 19, 1953, Mossadegh was arrested. He was tried, convicted of treason against a Shah who had himself fled the country days earlier and had to be flown back in by American aircraft. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, returned to power. And Iran, the democratic Iran that Mossadegh had tried to build, was gone. The oil went back under Western control. The CIA celebrated. A classified report from inside the agency later called it a quasi-miracle. One of the operation's lead architects, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was personally congratulated by President Eisenhower, but on the streets of Tehran, something else was happening. Something quiet, something deep. Something that would take decades to fully emerge. Emotional turn. Because this wasn't just politics. This was personal. For millions of Iranians, for the farmers and merchants and students and mothers and fathers who had voted for Mossadegh, who had believed that their country had finally taken its destiny into its own hands. This was a wound that didn't bleed visibly, a wound that healed over on the surface, but never truly closed. The lesson Iran learned in 1953 was not a political lesson. It was a human lesson. The lesson was simple and devastating. You cannot trust the West. When they speak of democracy, they mean their democracy. When they speak of freedom, they mean freedom that serves their interests. When they speak of rights, they mean the rights of their corporations and their governments, not yours. Distrust. That word, distrust, doesn't capture the weight of what was planted in 1953. It was deeper than distrust. It was a kind of grief. A grief for what could have been. A grief for a democratic Iran that was taken away before it had a chance to prove itself. And underneath the grief, a slow, patient, burning rage. A rage that would not fade, that would not forgive, that would wait. For 26 years. It would wait. Chapter to -1979. The explosion. 26 years passed. On the surface, everything looked stable. The Shah was in power. Iran was modernizing, at least by Western metrics. New highways, new universities, a growing middle class in Tehran, Western music in the cafes, women in miniskirts in the capital's fashionable districts. Iran, as it appeared on the covers of international magazines, was a success story, but underneath the surface, something was rotting. The Shah's regime was built on brutality. SAVAK, his secret police, trained and equipped with American assistance, arrested, tortured, and disappeared thousands of Iranians. Critics of the government vanished. Journalists were silenced. Political parties were banned. The Shah ruled not through consent but through fear. And the gap between the gleaming surface of Iran's modernization and the reality of daily life for ordinary Iranians was vast. Rural poverty was severe. The oil wealth that was supposed to lift all boats had been swallowed by the elite, by corruption, by the Shah's inner circle, and the foreign interests that supported him. The people remembered. 1953. They had not forgotten what democracy looked like and what had been stolen from them. And, in the mosques and the seminaries, and the underground networks of opposition, a different kind of Iran was being imagined. In 1978, the pressure became impossible to contain. Massive protests erupted across Iran. Workers went on strike. The army was ordered to fire on demonstrators, and in some cases, it did. But the movement kept growing. It was something the Shah had not anticipated. A revolution that didn't fear death. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the man the CIA had put back on the peacock throne in 1953, packed his bags and left Iran. He never returned. On February 1, 1979, a plane landed at Tehran's Mehrabad airport. On board was an old man with a long white beard and hard, unreadable eyes. He had been living in exile for 15 years, first in Iraq, then in France. He had spent those years writing and teaching and waiting. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini, and when he stepped off that plane, the streets of Tehran erupted. Millions of people had come to see him. Millions who had not agreed on much else. Communists and nationalists and Islamists and Democrats had united around one idea: the Shah must go. And the Shah had gone. What came next would define Iran for generations. Khomeini and his followers moved quickly to consolidate power. A referendum established the Islamic Republic. A new constitution placed supreme authority in the hands of a religious leader, the supreme leader. The revolution that had included so many different factions was steadily narrowed. Leftists were purged. Women were required to wear the hijab. The press was censored. Opposition figures were imprisoned or executed. The dream of many Iranians, a revolution that would bring freedom, curdled into something else. But for America, the revolution was a different kind of nightmare entirely. An ally had been lost. A strategic partner, one that sat on the Persian Gulf, bordered the Soviet Union, and controlled a critical choke point of global oil trade, had turned hostile overnight. And then came the moment that would define the relationship between the United States and Iran for decades. November 4, 1979. A group of Iranian students, calling themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They scaled the walls. They overwhelmed the guards. They moved through the compound building by building, room by room. And they took hostages. 60-6 American diplomats and embassy staff were captured. 14 were later released. 52 Americans were held for 444 days. The images were broadcast around the world. Blindfolded Americans, Iranian students chanting, burning American flags, signs that read, "Down with the USA." For the United States, this was a humiliation unlike any in modern history. The most powerful nation on earth could not free its own diplomats. A rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in catastrophe in the Iranian desert when helicopters malfunctioned and 8 American soldiers died without ever reaching Tehran. The humiliation was complete. For Iran, or at least for Khomeini and his supporters, this was something else entirely. It was revenge. It was proof that the revolution was real, that Iran would no longer bow to American pressure. The embassy, they said, was a den of spies, a place from which the CIA had orchestrated the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. Taking it was not a crime. It was justice. And so the two nations stared at each other across an unbridgeable gulf. The United States imposed sanctions. Iran refused to negotiate meaningfully for months. President Carter's presidency was consumed and ultimately destroyed by the crisis. Ronald Reagan won the 1980 election in part because the hostages had not been freed on Carter's watch. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, the exact day Reagan was inaugurated. Some have alleged this was not coincidental, that the Reagan team had made a back-channel deal with Iran to delay the release until after the election. The full truth of this has never been definitively established, but the suspicion has never entirely gone away. The hostages came home, but the wound did not heal. Chapter 3, The War Behind the War, 1980 to 1988. While the hostage crisis was playing out, another catastrophe was unfolding. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces crossed the border into Iran. Saddam Hussein, who had been watching the chaos of the Iranian Revolution with a mixture of fear and opportunism, launched a full-scale invasion. He expected a quick victory. The Iranian military had been gutted by the revolution. The Shah's generals had been arrested or executed. The Air Force was grounded for lack of spare parts. Iran, Saddam calculated, was vulnerable. He was wrong. What followed was 8 years of industrial-scale slaughter. The Iran-Iraq War became one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century, a war fought in trenches, with chemical weapons, with waves of young men sent across minefields. Iran lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Entire cities were bombed. Civilian casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. And the United States. The United States supported Saddam. Not openly at first, but the Reagan administration tilted firmly toward Iraq. American intelligence was shared with Iraqi forces. American agricultural credits were used to free up Iraqi funds for military purchases. When Saddam used chemical weapons, mustard gas, and nerve agents against Iranian soldiers and against Kurdish civilians in northern Iraq, The United States looked away, publicly condemned, then quietly continued the relationship. The logic was cold. Iran was the enemy. Iraq was a counterbalance. If the two bled each other, that served American interests. For Iranians, this was not lost. They watched American officials shake hands with Saddam Hussein. They watched the United States supply the man who was gassing their sons and brothers. They added it to the ledger. 1953, the Shah, the hostages, and now this. The ledger was growing long. Then, in July 1988, in the final months of the war, came an event that deepened the wound in ways that have never fully healed. On July 3, 1988, USS Vincennes, an American guided missile cruiser operating in the Persian Gulf, shot down Iran Air Flight 655. 290 people were on board. All of them died. The majority were Iranian civilians. There were 66 children among the dead. The U.S. military said it was a tragic mistake. The crew had misidentified the commercial aircraft as a military jet. The investigation found errors in procedure, errors in judgment, errors in the heat of a tense operational environment. The United States expressed regret. It did not apologize. It eventually paid $61.8 million in compensation to the families, without admitting legal liability. The captain of the Vincennes was later awarded the Legion of Merit. In Iran, to this day, Flight 655 is not remembered as a tragic accident. It is remembered as a massacre. As proof of American contempt for Iranian lives, the war ended in a ceasefire in August 1988. Khomeini, who had refused to end the war for years because he wanted to push into Iraq, famously compared accepting the ceasefire to drinking poison. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The borders were unchanged from before the war began, and the shadow war between America and Iran, fought through proxies and silence and mutual hatred, continued. Chapter 4, The Nuclear Questioning. The 1990s, the world changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. America emerged as the sole superpower, and Iran, isolated, sanctioned, economically damaged from 8 years of war, watched this new world order take shape and drew its own conclusions. The conclusion was this: nations without nuclear weapons get invaded. Nations with nuclear weapons do not. They looked at what happened to Saddam Hussein, who had been America's ally and then, when he became inconvenient, was destroyed in the Gulf War and ultimately invaded in 2003. They looked at Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear program and was later killed after a NATO intervention. They looked at North Korea, which had nuclear weapons and which no one invaded. The lesson seemed clear. Iran's nuclear program had actually begun under the Shah, with American assistance. The United States had helped build Iran's nuclear infrastructure in the 1970s, when Iran was an ally. After the revolution, that assistance ended, but the infrastructure remained. By the early 2000s, Iran's nuclear program had advanced significantly. Uranium enrichment facilities, centrifuges spinning, heavy water reactors. Iran said it was for civilian energy. The West didn't believe them. By the mid-2000s, Iran was the central foreign policy obsession of the Bush administration, particularly after the invasion of Iraq, which had placed American forces on Iran's western border, and Afghanistan, which had placed them on Iran's eastern border. Iran found itself, quite literally, surrounded. This produced a paradox. The more pressure America applied, the more Iran felt the need for a nuclear deterrent. The more Iran advanced its nuclear program, the more pressure America applied. In 2006, Iran enriched uranium to reactor-grade levels. The United Nations imposed sanctions. The European Union joined. The United States tightened restrictions. But Iran did not stop. Then, in 2010, something strange began happening to Iran's nuclear centrifuges. They started breaking. Not from where, from something else. From a computer virus so sophisticated that it had never been seen before. Its name was Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a joint American-Israeli cyberweapon, developed under a program called Operation Olympic Games that had begun under George W. Bush and accelerated under Barack Obama. It was designed specifically to destroy Iranian centrifuges while making them appear to operate normally. It was the world's first known use of a cyberweapon to physically destroy industrial infrastructure. Hundreds of centrifuges were destroyed. Iran's nuclear program was set back. Estimates vary by months or years, but it was not stopped. And when it became clear what had happened, Iran drew another lesson. They had been attacked, not with missiles, with code, but attacked nonetheless. And they began building their own cyber capabilities. The shadow war had entered a new domain. In 2012 and 2013, Iranian hackers launched massive cyber attacks against American banks, disrupting the websites of Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and others. In 2012, a devastating cyber attack, widely attributed to Iran, possibly in retaliation for Stuxnet, hit Saudi Aramco, the Saudi oil company that Iran viewed as a proxy for American interests. 30,000 computers were destroyed. The war in the shadows had gone digital. Meanwhile, the nuclear negotiations continued. Years of talks, proposals and counter-proposals, deadlines set and missed. And then, in 2015, something unexpected happened: a deal. Chapter 5: The Deal and Its Destruction. Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, known simply as the Iran nuclear deal, was signed in Vienna on July 14, 2015. It was the product of years of diplomacy. The United States, the European Union, China, Russia, Germany, France, Britain, all at the table with Iran. All agreed. Iran would significantly limit its nuclear program. It would reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium. It would allow unprecedented international inspections. It would dismantle thousands of centrifuges. In exchange, sanctions relief, the ability to sell oil again, the return of frozen assets, a chance to rejoin the global economy. For a moment, something remarkable seemed possible. Not friendship, the word was too strong, the wounds too deep, but coexistence, a framework, a way to manage the conflict without it exploding. President Obama called it a diplomatic breakthrough. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani spoke of a new chapter. The streets of Tehran saw spontaneous celebrations. Ordinary Iranians who had watched their economy shrink under sanctions, who had watched their currency collapse, who had watched the price of medicine and food rise year after year, finally felt something that resembled hope. The deal held for 2 years. Then Donald Trump was elected. President Trump had called the nuclear deal the worst deal ever negotiated. He had promised to tear it up. His advisors, particularly National Security Advisor John Bolton, who had long advocated military action against Iran, pushed for maximum pressure. On May 8, 2018, Trump announced the United States was withdrawing from the JCPOA. He reimposed all the sanctions that had been lifted, and added more. The policy was officially called maximum pressure. The goal, as stated by Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, was to bring Iran's economy to its knees, to force a change in Iranian behavior, or, some believed, a change in the Iranian government itself. The effects were severe. Iran's currency lost nearly 80% of its value. Inflation surged. Unemployment rose. The middle class, which had begun to breathe again after the 2015 deal, was crushed. Iran's response was to begin advancing its nuclear program again. More enrichment, more centrifuges, moving closer and closer to the threshold that, if crossed, would produce weapons-grade material. The deal was dead, and no one had a plan for what came next. And then came January 2020. Chapter 6, The Assassination and Its Consequence. In the early hours of January 3, 2020, a convoy of vehicles was moving through the roads near Baghdad International Airport. In one of the vehicles was General Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was not a name known to most people outside the Middle East, but within the region and within intelligence agencies around the world, he was one of the most powerful and feared military figures alive. As the commander of the Quds Force, the elite foreign operations branch of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, he had spent decades building and directing Iran's network of proxy forces across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Assad's forces in Syria. The map of Iranian influence across the Middle East was, to a significant degree, the map Soleimani had drawn with his own hands. American officials blamed him personally for the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers in Iraq, killed by roadside bombs supplied and directed by Quds Force-connected militias. They had been hunting him for years. On January 3, 2020, a U.S. drone fired missiles at his convoy. Soleimani was killed instantly. The reaction in Iran was extraordinary. Millions of people poured into the streets for his funeral. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, wept publicly. In parliament, chants of death to America echoed through the chamber. Iran's government promised revenge. The Trump administration said the strike had made America safer, that Soleimani had been actively developing plans to attack American personnel, that this was defensive action. Critics, including many American military and intelligence veterans, warned of the consequences. You do not kill someone of this stature without paying a price. Iran's response came on January 8, 2020. It launched a coordinated ballistic missile strike against two Iraqi air bases housing American troops, Al-Assad and Erbil. For hours, the world held its breath. 17 missiles impacted American positions. This was the first time Iran had directly and openly attacked American forces. Miraculously, there were no American fatalities. The bases had received advance warning. The Iranian strikes, some analysts noted, appeared to have been designed to cause damage without killing Americans, a message, not a massacre. Iran needed to respond, but it also, perhaps, did not want a full war. Trump announced he would not escalate further. All is well, he tweeted in the hours after the strikes, but the same night, in the chaos and heightened military alert following the strikes, Iranian air defenses shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 75 shortly after takeoff from Tehran. 176 people died, all on board. Iran initially denied responsibility, then, faced with overwhelming evidence, admitted it. The Iranian government said it was a tragic mistake, that a nervous operator had misidentified the civilian aircraft as an incoming threat, that in the fog of an unprecedented military escalation, a catastrophic error had been made. The parallels to Flight 655, the Iranian passenger jet shot down by the USS Vincennes in 1988, were not lost on anyone. Both tragedies, both denied and then admitted, both killing hundreds of civilians, both attributed to the fog of conflict between these two nations. The cycle had found its mirror image. Cause damage without killing Americans, a message, not a massacre. Iran needed to respond, but it also, perhaps, did not want a full war. Trump announced he would not escalate further. All is well, he tweeted in the hours after the strikes, but the same night, in the chaos and heightened military alert following the strikes, Iranian air defenses shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 75 shortly after takeoff from Tehran. 176 people died, all on board. Iran initially denied responsibility, then, faced with overwhelming evidence, admitted it. The Iranian government said it was a tragic mistake, that a nervous operator had misidentified the civilian aircraft as an incoming threat, that in the fog of an unprecedented military escalation, a catastrophic error had been made. The parallels to Flight 655, the Iranian passenger jet shot down by the USS Vincennes in 1988, were not lost on anyone. Both tragedies, both denied and then admitted, both killing hundreds of civilians, both attributed to the fog of conflict between these two nations. The cycle had found its mirror image. Iran. Hezbollah is the crown jewel, a powerful force on Israel's northern border, a deterrent against any Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. In Palestine, Iran has funded and armed both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The relationship is complicated. Hamas is a Sunni organization, and Iran is predominantly Shia, but shared enmity toward Israel created a pragmatic alliance. Iranian weapons have flowed into Gaza through tunnels and sea routes. The rockets fired at Israeli cities have, in many cases, been supplied or funded by Iran. In Iraq, after the American invasion toppled Saddam Hussein, Iran moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Billions of dollars and thousands of advisors and operatives flooded into Iraq. Shia militias, many of them directly funded and commanded through Soleimani's coup force, became major power players in Iraqi politics and security. These same militias were responsible for killing hundreds of American soldiers with sophisticated roadside bombs and rocket attacks during the occupation. In Syria, when civil war erupted in 2011 and threatened to bring down Bashar al-Assad, Iran's crucial ally and the bridge between Iran and Hezbollah, Iran intervened massively. Money, weapons, fighters, and eventually Hezbollah forces poured into Syria to keep Assad in power. Soleimani personally directed aspects of the Syrian campaign. Russian air power joined later. Together they saved the Assad regime. In Yemen, Iran has supported the Houthi movement, officially known as Ansar Allah, which controls much of northern Yemen, including the capital Sana'a. The Houthis have launched missile and drone attacks against Saudi Arabia and, in 2023 and 2024, began targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's most critical maritime choke points for the United States and its allies. This network represents a strategic threat of the first order. For Iran, it represents survival. The logic is straightforward. A country that is under constant threat of military attack by the most powerful military on Earth, that is surrounded by American bases, that has been subjected to sanctions for decades, that watched a neighboring country get invaded and its leader hanged, that country needs insurance. The proxy network is Iran's insurance policy, but insurance policies have costs, and the cost of Iran's network has been paid, in part, by ordinary people across the Middle East, Lebanese citizens who live under the shadow of Hezbollah's state within a state, Yemeni civilians caught in a devastating war, Syrians who suffered under Assad with Iranian support. The war between America and Iran has never been clean. The victims have never been only the intended ones. Chapter 8: The Invisible War, Cyber, Assassination, and Sabotage. In the 21st century, the war between the United States and Iran expanded into a new theater. Not deserts, not oceans. Code. We've already talked about Stuxnet, the cyber weapon that destroyed Iranian centrifuges in 2010, but Stuxnet was not the beginning of the cyber conflict, and it was certainly not the end. Iran had been building its cyber capabilities since the early 2000s. The country that had suffered a sophisticated cyber attack now began developing sophisticated cyber attacks of its own. Iranian hackers, some operating independently, many affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, became increasingly active and increasingly capable. They hit American banks, they hit Saudi Aramco, they targeted infrastructure in the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and across the Gulf states. They developed tools to conduct surveillance on dissidents and journalists and opposition figures, both inside Iran and in the diaspora. And the United States, meanwhile, was not only using Stuxnet. A broader program of sabotage and intelligence operations targeting Iran's nuclear program was underway. Iranian nuclear scientists began dying between 2010 and 2012. 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in targeted assassinations. The attacks followed a similar pattern. A motorcyclist would approach the scientist's car in Tehran traffic and attach a magnetic bomb to the door, detonated remotely. Then the motorcyclist would disappear. Iran blamed Israel and the United States. Israel never officially confirmed or denied involvement, but intelligence assessments, reporting from multiple outlets, and later revelations pointed to Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, as the operational force, with American knowledge and possible cooperation. For Iran, the murder of its scientists was not just a strategic setback, it was an outrage. These were not soldiers. They were engineers and physicists, husbands, fathers, professors. They were killed in their cars, in front of their families, on the streets of their own capital. Iran retaliated. Iranian-linked operatives attempted assassinations against Israeli diplomats in multiple countries: India, Georgia, Thailand, Azerbaijan. Most of the attempts failed. Some succeeded in killing or wounding targets. Chapter 8: The Invisible War, Cyber, Assassination, and Sabotage. In the 21st century, the war between the United States and Iran expanded into a new theater. Not deserts, not oceans. Code. We've already talked about Stuxnet, the cyber weapon that destroyed Iranian centrifuges in 2010, but Stuxnet was not the beginning of the cyber conflict, and it was certainly not the end. Iran had been building its cyber capabilities since the early 2000s. The country that had suffered a sophisticated cyber attack now began developing sophisticated cyber attacks of its own. Iranian hackers, some operating independently, many affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, became increasingly active and increasingly capable. They hit American banks, they hit Saudi Aramco, they targeted infrastructure in the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and across the Gulf states. They developed tools to conduct surveillance on dissidents and journalists and opposition figures, both inside Iran and in the diaspora. And the United States, meanwhile, was not only using Stuxnet. A broader program of sabotage and intelligence operations targeting Iran's nuclear program was underway. Iranian nuclear scientists began dying between 2010 and 2012. 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in targeted assassinations. The attacks followed a similar pattern. A motorcyclist would approach the scientist's car in Tehran traffic and attach a magnetic bomb to the door, detonated remotely. Then the motorcyclist would disappear. Iran blamed Israel and the United States. Israel never officially confirmed or denied involvement, but intelligence assessments, reporting from multiple outlets, and later revelations pointed to Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, as the operational force, with American knowledge and possible cooperation. For Iran, the murder of its scientists was not just a strategic setback, it was an outrage. These were not soldiers. They were engineers and physicists, husbands, fathers, professors. They were killed in their cars, in front of their families, on the streets of their own capital. Iran retaliated. Iranian-linked operatives attempted assassinations against Israeli diplomats in multiple countries: India, Georgia, Thailand, Azerbaijan. Most of the attempts failed. Some succeeded in killing or wounding targets. Chapter 9. Iran from within. The people between two fires throughout all of this: the sanctions, the proxy wars, the nuclear negotiations, the assassinations. There is a dimension of this story that often gets lost: the Iranian people. Not the government, not the Revolutionary Guard, not the supreme leader or the president or the hardliners in parliament. The people, 85 million human beings living in the middle of this conflict, who had very little say in how it unfolded, who bore the costs that neither government in Washington nor in Tehran was required to pay personally. The sanctions, whatever their intended target, fell on ordinary Iranians. The cost of medicine rose, imports dried up, the pharmaceutical industry, already struggling, lost access to essential equipment and ingredients. Businesses closed. The professional class, doctors, engineers, academics, emigrated in massive numbers. An ongoing brain drain that has hollowed out Iranian institutions. The younger generation of Iranians is, in many ways, deeply ambivalent about the Islamic Republic. Polls conducted carefully, given the constraints of operating in an authoritarian state, have consistently shown that young Iranians want reform, want engagement with the world, want to be part of the global economy and global culture. Many of them do not hate America. Many admire it, its culture, its universities, its openness, and yet they are treated as enemies by its policies. And when they rise up against their own government, as they have repeatedly done, they find themselves caught between two forces that seem, from their perspective, equally indifferent to their actual lives. In 2009, the Green Movement erupted. Millions took to the streets after a disputed presidential election. They were met with violence. Leaders were arrested. The movement was crushed. The West expressed concern but did little. In 2019, protests exploded again, this time triggered by a sudden, sharp increase in fuel prices. The government's response was brutal. Internet access was cut. Security forces opened fire on protesters. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. In 2022, the most significant uprising since the revolution, Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, died in the custody of Iran's morality police after being arrested for allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. Her death ignited something that had been building for years. Women across Iran publicly removed their hijabs. Young people, men and women together, took to the streets in cities from Tehran to Zahedan to Mashhad. The slogan was three words in Persian: Zan, Zindagi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. The government cracked down with lethal force. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. Executions followed for those convicted of protest-related charges. The world watched, expressed condemnation, imposed limited additional sanctions, and the protests eventually subsided, not because the desire for change had died, but because the cost of expressing it had become too high. For America, this presented an uncomfortable paradox. The stated goal of maximum pressure was, in part, to produce change inside Iran, to weaken the regime. But the evidence suggests that external pressure, sanctions, isolation, has actually strengthened hardliners by allowing them to blame all of Iran's problems on foreign enemies, and by impoverishing precisely the middle class and civil society actors who are most likely to push for reform from within. The Iranian people are caught between a government that does not represent them and a foreign policy that punishes them. That paradox has no easy resolution, and acknowledging it honestly is the beginning of understanding how complex this conflict truly is. Authoritarian states have consistently shown that young Iranians want reform, want engagement with the world, want to be part of the global economy and global culture. Many of them do not hate America. Many admire it, its culture, its universities, its openness. And yet they are treated as enemies by its policies. And when they rise up against their own government, as they have repeatedly done, they find themselves caught between two forces that seem, from their perspective, equally indifferent to their actual lives. In 2009, the Green Movement erupted. Millions took to the streets after a disputed presidential election. They were met with violence. Leaders were arrested. The movement was crushed. The West expressed concern but did little. In 2019, protests exploded again, this time triggered by a sudden, sharp increase in fuel prices. The government's response was brutal. Internet access was cut. Security forces opened fire on protesters. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. In 2022, the most significant uprising since the revolution, Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, died in the custody of Iran's morality police after being arrested for allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. Her death ignited something that had been building for years. Women across Iran publicly removed their hijabs. Young people, men and women together, took to the streets in cities from Tehran to Zahedan to Mashhad. The slogan was three words in Persian: Zan, Zindagi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. The government cracked down with lethal force. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. Executions followed for those convicted of protest-related charges. The world watched, expressed condemnation, imposed limited additional sanctions, and the protests eventually subsided, not because the desire for change had died, but because the cost of expressing it had become too high. For America, this presented an uncomfortable paradox. The stated goal of maximum pressure was, in part, to produce change inside Iran, to weaken the regime. But the evidence suggests that external pressure, sanctions, isolation, has actually strengthened hardliners by allowing them to blame all of Iran's problems on foreign enemies, and by impoverishing precisely the middle class and civil society actors who are most likely to push for reform from within. The Iranian people are caught between a government that does not represent them and a foreign policy that punishes them. That paradox has no easy resolution, and acknowledging it honestly is the beginning of understanding how complex this conflict truly is. The United States was pulled closer to the edge of a direct confrontation than at any point since 1979. The situation in the region remains volatile. The Houthis continue to target shipping in the Red Sea. Hezbollah and Israel fought a significant conflict in late 2024. The web of Iranian proxies stretches from Gaza to Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, and at the center of it all, the nuclear question. The question that, if answered in the wrong way at the wrong moment, could change everything. The shadow war has never been closer to becoming a real one. The United States was pulled closer to the edge of a direct confrontation than at any point since 1979. The situation in the region remains volatile. The Houthis continue to target shipping in the Red Sea. Hezbollah and Israel fought a significant conflict in late 2024. The web of Iranian proxies stretches from Gaza to Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, and at the center of it all, the nuclear question. The question that, if answered in the wrong way at the wrong moment, could change everything. The shadow war has never been closer to becoming a real one. It is a history of decisions made in secret, decisions made by people who will never pay the price, for consequences felt by people who were never consulted. In 1953, CIA officers in a foreign capital decided to overthrow a democracy. They did not ask the Iranian people if they consented. In 1979, Khomeini's followers decided to hold diplomats hostage. They did not ask the American people if they thought it was wise. In 2018, advisors in Washington decided to destroy a nuclear deal. They did not ask Iranians who had danced in the streets in 2015. In 2020, a drone strike killed a general. No one asked the Iranian civilians who would bear the consequences of the retaliation, or the Ukrainian families who lost their loved ones when Iran, in its heightened state of alert, shot down the wrong aircraft. The decisions are made at the top. The costs fall to the bottom. And the war continues, not because ordinary Americans and ordinary Iranians hate each other. They do not, in any meaningful sense. Iranian students in American universities, Iranian-American communities across the United States, shared love of poetry and food and family and the idea that life should mean something. The war continues because of the gravity of history, because the institutions and ideologies and mutual Wounds and strategic interests that drive the conflict are larger than the individuals caught inside it, because once a war like this begins, not with a declaration, not with the first shot, but with a decision made in secret in 1953, it is very, very hard to end. This is the war that has no name, the war that began before most people alive today were born, the war that has never officially started. The war that has never officially ended, the war that is still being fought. Right now. In shadows you cannot see. In decisions being made without your knowledge. In consequences that have not yet arrived. The question no one asks is, how does it end? And the honest answer, the only honest answer, is that no one knows. But the first step toward an answer might be the simplest and most difficult thing of all. To look at this history honestly. To name what happened. To count the costs. To hear the stories of the people who have paid them. Not to assign blame, not to declare a winner, but to understand. Because you cannot navigate out of a conflict you refuse to see clearly. And this conflict, this long, shadowed, nameless war, deserves to be seen clearly, fully, honestly, for the sake of everyone still caught inside it.
We want freedom. We will not be silenced.